very frequently. With that, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists here to discuss this issue. Rabbi Jenna Shah is the Associate Director of Israel Campaigns and Education for TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. Emma Salzberg is the U.S. Strategic Campaigns Director for the Diaspora Alliance, and Dr. Josh Shanes is an Associate Professor for Jewish Studies and the Associate Director of Jewish Studies Program at the College of Charleston. To start off, I'm just going to kind of do an overarching, broad couple questions. We're here because we believe strongly that anti-Semitism is a serious threat, and we as progressives have a unique ability to push back in ways that bring groups together around solutions instead of using fear to create divisions. I'd love for you guys to give a 3-minute elevator pitch, if you can, on the following. Why you came to Netroots here this year, why should the progressive community care about learning about anti-Semitism, what are the stakes of fighting it for our movement, and how are progressives poised to fight it more effectively than conservatives? And I'm going to start to my right and start with Rabbi Jenna.
First off, thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Kevin. It's really, truly a gift to be on a panel with such amazing, smart, thoughtful, and kind humans. I feel lucky to learn with and from you all every day. As was said in the introduction, my name is Rabbi Jenna Shah. I work for TRUA, and TRUA represents 2,300 rabbis and cantors. And part of our role is both representing rabbis and cantors, but organizing and supporting them as they emotionally and think strategically about what it means to engage with this moment. And we are in a moment. We are in a moment where we're seeing a crumbling and a crash within the Jewish community. The Jewish community, which I'll talk a little bit more later, is asking itself, what does it mean to show up in these spaces? What does it mean to step into both mainstream and progressive spaces? And what litmus tests need to be answered to in order to show up in those spaces? And we're seeing Jews need to answer to purity tests before and when they enter into a space. For instance, on the right, mainstream Jewish institutions are saying to Jews that they view as not Zionist enough, that you're anti-Semitic, you're not Jewish enough, you're this, you're that, you're that. And that is a deep danger to the Jewish community. And it diminishes the beauty of the Jewish community that exists. And on the left, many Jews are being forced to answer for Israel and are being equated to the entirety of Israel and what Israel is doing. And if they're not left and critical of Israel enough, they're being viewed as anti-this, anti-that. And the word anti-Semitism is creating an incredibly difficult situation for our ability to show up in partnerships and in coalition. And we believe so deeply that we need each other. We need relationships, and we need these coalitions in order to fight the broader threat of white supremacy. And if anti-Semitism poses a threat and creates this murkiness that tears apart the left, we need to fight it, and we need to fight it together. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Josh?
Thanks. See if I can get this right. Thank you all for coming, and for everyone who is streaming at home, which for all we know is thousands and thousands of people. I'm going to assume as much. It is a delight to be with comrades. You know, I'm normally in spaces with plenty of lovely people, but hard to call them brothers in arms, sisters in arms. And it's nice to be in a space. If you ask why we came here, it's nice, at least for a short while, to be in a space where we can talk a little bit more freely, even if we don't always agree. So I came for my own reason, for that personal reason, but I would also say my goal, I'm an academic. I study Zionism and anti-Semitism and Jewish politics and American and Israeli politics. And this is what I write about in the popular and academic outlets I use. And it seems to me that the best thing I can do, I'm not a good organizer. I'm not organized, actually. But what I am good at is discourse. And what I'm good at, what I'm trained to do, is to help us understand what we're saying when we're saying things and what we're not saying, and to understand the implications of what we're saying. Because when I hear conversations on social media, in person, often in well-edited, vetted articles, I see people not really knowing what they're saying or what the implications are, often well-meaning, often, not well-meaning or less well-meaning. But what we need to do is get down to the nitty-gritty and say, what are you actually getting at? What are you actually saying? What is, what are you getting at when you talk about Jews this way, or Israel this way, or Zionism this way, or anti-Zionism this way? And that's why I'm here, and that's why I come to these events, because that's the only real contribution I can make, but I think it's an important one. You asked, I don't know if you're going to follow up with this. I had the questions that you prepared me. Why should we care? There was a very packed room yesterday talking about Israel and Gaza with some wonderful speakers. And it was about how the misuse of the charge of anti-Semitism is used to suppress activism. And that's a very important topic that I'm very interested in. It's why I support one definition of anti-Semitism over another, JDA over IRA, Nexus over IRA. I'm on the Nexus committee. But if we on the left, I think I'm on the left, need to consider what anti-Semitism is if we're going to respond to its misuse. If we ignore what anti-Semitism is and isn't, we really have no ability to respond to people when they fling the charge to suppress activism. We have to understand what it actually is in order to grapple with it, both to solve anti-Semitism, that's presumptuous, both to address anti-Semitism, to hopefully address its worst outlets, but also to address its misuse and to protect space for the kind of work and protest that we want to do.
Thanks so much. Emma?
Hi, all. Lots of alignment, if not perfect agreement, which makes sense. My name is Emma Salzberg. I'm the U.S. Strategic Campaigns Director at Diaspora Alliance. Diaspora Alliance is a small and new international and internationalist organization, and we work to fight anti-Semitism and the instrumentalization of anti-Semitism as part of the broader fight for multiracial, pluralistic democracy here and around the world. And so I'm here because anti-Semitism is an urgent and complex subject for our movements to understand, and that part of the reason why it's so hard to understand is intentional, that there are intentional efforts to distort and confuse and the meaning of anti-Semitism, and we need to work hard to see through those. That cynical misrepresentations of anti-Semitism are a key tactic right now in authoritarian politics in the US and around the world. And so, like Josh said, if our movements don't understand how anti-Semitism actually manifests and the work that it does to divide us from one another, we'll never be as powerful as we need to be in order to fight what is coming at us. And that includes the fight for justice for all people between the river and the sea and Israel-Palestine. That part of what fuels support for Israel, part of what fuels defense of Israel, Israeli impunity, is fear of anti-Semitism. And so that if we are not doing the work to address and dismantle anti-Semitism wherever we are, we're not actually doing everything we can in that fight for justice for all people in Israel-Palestine. And, to zoom out a little bit, right, why are progressives suited for this fight? As progressives, we believe that oppression and injustice that is created by human beings can be dismantled by human beings. And a progressive politics of building solidarity across differences, of committing to one another's liberation, is the key to undoing anti-Semitism. We have to be in this with each other. And today, the loudest voices that we see claiming the mantle of fighting anti-Semitism are on the political right. They claim to be protecting Jewish students on campus, to be going after, this rising tide of anti-Semitism at the same time that they are advancing a policy agenda that is incredibly dangerous to all of us. And conservatives, the right wing, are saying that anti-Semitism is a signal that we need to institute authoritarian policies, right, to repress political speech. And in reality, what that's doing, it's a tactic to advance an agenda that they were already trying to push forward anyway. That the fight against wokeness, the fight against critical race theory, the same mindset that passed don't say gay laws at the state level, right, to try to control what can be said in classrooms and on campuses, has now been incorporated. The fight against anti-Semitism has now been incorporated into that fight, right? That conservatives are actually saying, that universities are inherently anti-Semitic, that the study of race and racism and efforts to address ongoing inequalities in the form of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are themselves anti-Semitic. I'll talk more about this later, but if that has your head hurting, it hurts my head too, as well as my heart. And it's really a lack of understanding, a lack of clarity among progressives about what anti-Semitism is that allows that strategy to work so well. Because if we understood what anti-Semitism is and how it works, we would understand that isolating Jews, even in the name of protecting Jews, sets us up to be resented later on. The right wing is making Jews the face of political repression in a way that is incredibly dangerous. And it's degrading. It not only is it posing a threat to Jews, it's degrading our democratic institutions. And the first people in the line of fire are Palestinians, are Arabs, Muslims, and the supporters of the movement for freedom in Palestine. And so progressives have to do better, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you all so much. I think I would agree with Josh and with all of you, with everything you guys have said about why we're here and what we will be doing. And I want to ask to kind of dig in a little bit deeper with you, Emma, on what you talked about specifically around how authoritarian regimes and authoritarian politicians are using the mantle of anti-Semitism to abuse it as a repression. And I want to talk about Washington right now and what's going on in Washington, D.C., because a lot of what is happening around anti-Semitism beyond being in the States is also happening we're seeing it live streamed live from the Education and Labor Committee. We're seeing politicians say some pretty insane things. So I'm curious from you, how you see politicians and policymakers weighing in on this. Where are the lines being drawn around what is anti-Semitism, what is not anti-Semitic? And I think the biggest question I think I have, and I think a lot of people have, is why is there so much focus in DC right now on this need for definitions and definitions being incorporated into formal policy? And what do you see as the impact of this further down the line?
Yeah.
That's a lot, sorry.
No, I prepared. I'll start with the definitions question, then work into what's alive on Capitol Hill right now. So the reason why the conversation around anti-Semitism is so stuck in the frame of definitions is that there has been a campaign since the mid-2010s that has been coordinated among a constellation of organizations that are aligned with the Israeli government, pushing for the adoption of something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. I call it IRA, like it is a pesky old relative. It causes me a lot of trouble. The IRA definition of anti-Semitism at the intergovernmental, federal, state, local, and institutional, for example, universities, soccer clubs, levels in the US and around the world, right? So there's this push to institutionalize a definition of anti-Semitism. The problem with that, there are many problems with it. One is that certainly in the US, starting with definitions of forms of discrimination is not how US civil rights law works. The way that it works is introducing a protected class into law. So, for example, race or sex. And then as people bring complaints based on that form of discrimination, the way that it is defined in law builds up, right, through case law. We don't do top-down definitions of discrimination for any other forms for good reason, right? Like this, for just one example, if you're taking this as a good faith effort to fight anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism changes all the time. It shows up in new forms, right? When the COVID pandemic broke out, we saw tremendous amounts of COVID-related anti-Semitism, which a definition of anti-Semitism written before would not have been able to capture, right? So this is actually just like not a good or serious strategy for fighting anti-Semitism. What it is a very effective way to chill speech that is critical of Israel and Zionism. The IRA definition is extremely vague. It defines anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews, which like all of the close reading training I got in Hebrew school makes me itchy. And then it has 11 examples, 7 of which are related to speech about Israel. And as we can get into, as I'm sure Josh would love to talk about, that is like Israel-related anti-Semitism is part of what anti-Semitism is, but there's also pro-Israel related anti-Semitism, Zionist-related anti-Semitism, and many, many forms of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, tropes that are much older than political Zionism or the State of Israel. And so it's just like what it's actually doing, this campaign for the IR definition, is a push to chill Palestinian and anti-Zionist speech. And so it's just like, it's very, very dangerous. And like also, definitions are not what we need to be talking about. It's much more useful if you're actually trying to learn about anti-Semitism to look at frameworks. So at Diaspora Alliance, we also prefer the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, the JDA, and the Nexus document has many things to recommend also. Diaspora Alliance has a short explainer about anti-Semitism on our website that you can look up. But it's much better to actually, like if you're trying to understand anti-Semitism, it's better to get a framework, understand, okay, conspiracy theories, we are attributing excessive power to Jews, we're marking Jews as other or untrustworthy or disloyal. We're talking about greed or harm to children or like associating Jews with blood. There's like lots of things. But the IR definition is not really gonna teach you that. It's worth looking at to understand the politics of the issue, but it's not actually like a substantive way to learn about it. And that sort of authoritarian thread of this, right, the piece where this is an effort to control what kind of speech is permissible, has really picked up at the federal level post-October 7th. The Congressional Education and Workforce Committee hearings with university presidents that started in December got a huge amount of media attention, in large part because the presidents themselves did such a terrible job defending their own institutions and the values of academic freedom and freedom of speech. But they have been, and because they were so successful, the House Republicans have actually officially announced a coordinated strategy to hold hearings about campus anti-Semitism in a half dozen committees. Education and Workforce itself has done not only university president hearings, they did one about DEI, they did one about K-12 education. Just this week, they did one about unions, going after union locals that have passed ceasefire resolutions. And this is a strategy of exploiting concern about anti-Semitism, which like it's good that people are concerned about anti-Semitism, but Republicans are exploiting those concerns to pursue their long-standing policy goals, right? To attack institutions of higher education and threaten their funding using the mechanism of Title VI, to attack efforts to address inequities in education through DEI, to restrict immigration by threatening to revoke student visas for student protesters, and again, to undermine organized labor. And just to like really underline like the way that the right is using this messaging, in that first hearing with the 3 college presidents in December, Virginia Fox, in her opening statement, spoke about how universities, the university and anti-Semitism cannot be cleaved. The university is inherently anti-Semitic, and her evidence for that was naming specific courses in Harvard's course catalog about the history of race and racism in the Americas and about scientific racism, and saying that the fact that Harvard was teaching those classes was evidence of the university's anti-Semitic ideology. So this is like not a strategy for Democrats to get on board with, like full stop. This is not a good faith strategy. This is not about keeping Jews safe. This is about Republicans cynically exploiting concerns about Jews in order to advance their right-wing policy goals. And progressives really need to claim the moral high ground here, right? We care about anti-Semitism, and repression, attacking democratic institutions, is not a serious approach to addressing it. It's like actually abhorrent. Instead of accepting the premises of the argument, we need to call the strategy out for what it is and push back hard on the idea that undermining democratic norms and values, undermining civil rights protections, is a real solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, is a real way to keep Jewish students or Jewish Americans safe. And I want to shout out Representative Pramila Jayapal, who did a really good job with this at the union hearing this week, saying, we have actual problems to be dealing with, and it's disappointing that Republicans are going after union locals who are expressing their freedom of speech regarding Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. I will pause.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to that just because I'm going to take my moderator privileges to you. And you mentioned that Republicans are using this as a way to just kind of bring it out to the forefront, and we shouldn't be going along with this. But as you and I, and probably a lot of people know, there are many Democrats that are. Why?
Again, I think Republicans have identified an issue where Democrats are willing to make a trade-off between different values. We speak often of pro-Palestinian speech and efforts to repress it as the kind of tip of the spear. That's Lara Friedman's phrase from the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Shout out to Lara. But this is a long-standing exception. This is a long-standing vulnerability in Democrats' defense of small d democratic values that Republicans are exploiting. So throughout the 2010s, we saw anti-boycott laws, right? Anti-BDS laws at the state level. It's like 2/3 of states have those. And so Democrats, again, I think it's also rooted in real disagreements about where the lines are in between, and like this is not this sort of spatial metaphor about lines is like not my favorite way to talk about this, but people have disagreements about what kind of speech about Israel and Zionism is perhaps harsh and unpleasant but permissible versus actually like anti-Semitic and harmful. And we have big American Jewish communal organizations explicitly advancing the line that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which is incredibly damaging to the real fight against anti-Semitism. So that's what they're sort of playing on, and it's again, it's like a real failure on the part of the Democrats.
Thank you so much. Jenna, rabbis are at the forefront of efforts to counter anti-Semitism in ways we haven't seen in our country since the early 20th century. I'm going to hawk one of your own things. Trua recently came out with this handy-dandy guide, which I encourage all of you to come up and take one at the end. It's very helpful. I use it frequently. To understanding anti-Semitism. Your organization includes rabbis from across the spectrum, both left, right, center, and I'm curious if you can kind of elaborate on the challenges that they are encountering right now and what they're doing to help people through this fearful time. And then I think what are the other things I want to know is how can we as progressives work to help address that as well? I'll start there.
Yeah. I think I'll share a little bit about what personally brought me to this work, and from there I think that can help us understand a little bit about the narrative and what rabbis are experiencing in this moment. Is I grew up in a Jewish community in a big city, and so much of my Jewish experience and my Jewish education was rooted in the trauma of the Holocaust and fear of preventing anti-Semitism. And when that happened, I, as a child, I didn't know what anti-Semitism, I was like, what am I scared of? And my entire Jewish identity, whether I knew it or not, was built around fear. And when that happened, I was no longer able to fall in love with Judaism and Jewish tradition. I had to do a little bit of unlearning. I had to grapple with this question of fear-based religion to fall in love with a joy-based religion, a heart-centered religion, and a tradition that could hold me in such important and critical moments. Scholar Noah Feldman talks frequently about how if a rabbi were to stand up and give a speech or a sermon criticizing God, they'd be praised as an amazing rabbi, great sermon. If they were to stand up and give a sermon criticizing Israel or criticizing Holocaust education, they'd lose their job the next day. And this is what we're experiencing right now. The framework of fear-based Judaism around anti-Semitism has permeated so deeply within the Jewish community that it's creating incredible divisions within the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community. And it's hurting us. This is a moment where the Jewish community is in such deep, incredible trauma, and we need each other. We can't tear each other apart, and all the more so the left. A lot of my role since October 7th has been supporting rabbis through their emotions, has been helping them grapple with the real threats to safety and the real anti-Semitism that they are experiencing within their communities. Many are experiencing bomb threats. They're experiencing real terrifying threats. And there are many Jews who are simultaneously fearful. And they're fearful because of rhetoric around Palestinian solidarity. And it goes back to the fear-based approach to Judaism. And a lot of my role is working with clergy to discern what is making you feel uncomfortable versus what is real anti-Semitism. And it's an important distinction. And this moment, it's important to name, like, tensions are high and the stakes are incredibly high. Many within the Jewish community, for good reason, for some, felt incredibly betrayed by the left on October 7th and beyond. They felt as if they were isolated. And my role is to support them to think about what it means to step back in the heartbreak. Our role as progressives isn't to step away from coalition when it's hard. It's to step into the breach, to go through the messiness together and to dive into where are the differences and where is the pain, and how can the pain and these moments of betrayal actually help us build a stronger and safer left. I will say for us, like, we are a part of a deep ecosystem, as is modeled here. And part of the role, a lot of our rabbis are across the spectrum. We have rabbis in mainstream Jewish communities where if they dare say what is happening in Israel is wrong, they're losing their job and they're losing any political will they might have within their communities. So it's about working with them to see what does it mean to be a part of this larger ecosystem, to say, no, those who are calling for freeing of Palestine, calling what's happening a genocide, they're not bad Jews and they're not anti-Semitic. And our role is to say that we are in this together. I'll stop there, but so much more to say.
That was really amazing, and I normally have a follow-up, but I don't really want to take away from that, actually. So I'm gonna push forward and move to Josh, but really that was amazing. Thanks, Jenna. Josh, Emma talked about how definitions aren't needed in civil rights law to fight hate crimes, and that but it can be useful in some ways to raise awareness. And there are, all three of the different definitions of anti-Semitism, be it JDA, IRA, or Nexus, have some educational value, at least in some part. But one key difference stems from different perspectives of Zionism and criticism of Israel, even and especially inside the Jewish community, as Jenna just mentioned, and as I think all four of us could probably articulate from our different views as well. I'm going to ask a very tough question. Can you give a brief 101 on the origins of Zionism, how it plays out in the modern world, specifically with the diaspora community, and I would also ask about evangelicals as well, and how anti-Zionist rhetoric has sometimes crossed into that anti-Semitic territory?
Should I explain World War II as well?
No, stay away from World War II.
Okay. Although that's a tall order for a minute, but I want to just preamble two comments because I should have said them last round. First of all, we should remember we're interested in anti-Semitism for its own sake, right? Not only because of its connection to Israel-Palestine, but also because we care about anti-Semitism as we care about every form of hatred and discrimination. That's throwing that out there. And to that end, I think the Trua Guide is wonderful. If you want a longer read, I just reread Shane Burley's and Ben Lorber's Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism. If this were, one of those talk shows, I'd have one of those people here, but they're not. But I recommend it strongly. So that's first of all. Second of all, why are progressives better poised to fight anti-Semitism? I would list 4 issues that occurred to me as we're talking. First of all, anti-Semitism is a pillar of the right. It simply is. It's a foundation of the right. It's a problem on the left. And that's a big difference that we have to be aware of. So we are better poised to fight it. Second of all, progressives understand the difference, as you mentioned a second ago, between unsafe and uncomfortable in a way that is very helpful. In other words, the difference between feelings and systemic discrimination, systemic threats. We get that better. Therefore, we are better poised to address it. Third of all, we value academia and expertise and liberal values. And these are important things in order to fight anti-Semitism and every other form of hatred and discrimination. And finally, we get the importance of alliances, intersectionality, which is the only way we're going to fight any of these things. So I'm just throwing that out there. Now, Zionism. Zionisms are forms of sort of a spectrum of modern Jewish politics, of Jewish nationalism that emerges in the 1880s and 1890s. It emerges at the same time as lots and lots of other national movements, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Romanians, Palestinians, by the way. If you don't know Rashid Khalidi's work on the construction of Palestinian nationhood, you really should read it. It's very important. It was a work that inspired my own first book on the construction of Jewish nationhood. And construction means not invention. It means, and here you have to read people like Benedict Anderson and other nationalist theorists, it means construction, right? Nations use building blocks that exist out there, like your kid has a box of building blocks, right? They really do exist in some ontological sense, but the way they're put together is a construction that could be put together in different ways. One of them is nationhood. That's what Zionists do. They don't agree on almost anything back in the day or today. They don't agree even on the necessity of a state. Most didn't actually necessarily want a state. They disagree on the kind of state it's going to be, those who wanted a state. They disagreed on where it was going to be at first. Lots of things, but the one thing they agree on are that Jews constitute some sort of modern nation, or in America it became a kind of a people. American Jews prefer the term people because they want to insist that they themselves are American, but Jews in Israel or in Europe, those are national Jews, but we're a people. There's a whole history there. I can point you to scholarship. But that's the key point, right? The key point is that identity. That's the key part of Zionism, that the most helpful way to think about Zionism is not simply as a political ideology, but a religio-political ideology, an identity, a form of Jewishness. So, right, so just like in the modern world, new denominations of Judaism appeared, right? Reform and conservative and Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox and so on. So Zionisms came out as a form of Jewishness, right? A form of understanding what it meant to be a Jew, the ritual obligations of being a Jew, who's a good Jew, who's a bad Jew, like all of these sorts of what texts we emphasize and what texts we suppress, what traditions we emphasize and what traditions we suppress. Every form of modern Judaism does this. No one is more or less legitimate than the other. I certainly like some more than others, but that doesn't mean I know what's right. I don't have, God's ear or whatever. But it's a form of Jewishness, and that's what's critical. And especially in America, since the 1970s, Israelism, for lack of a better term, Zionism, but without the Zionism, this sort of affiliation with Israel has become the centerpiece of Judaism for many, many, many Jews. It's not one I personally love or even participate in, but then again, I'm also not a Reform Jew, and so what am I to say who's right or who's wrong? But that's what people are missing. So when we talk about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, what we have to understand is there's often a disconnect, right? The key myth of anti-Semitism, and I think both of you mentioned this already, is the idea of a global Jewish conspiracy, a nefarious global Jewish conspiracy. And it doesn't matter if you blame George Soros as the image of that conspiracy, or Rothschild, or the State of Israel. If you're talking about a global Jewish conspiracy, that's anti-Semitism. And that's what we have to fight. So if we keep that in mind, this ambiguity, so what happens is this disconnect, right? You have anti-Zionist or anti-Israel protesters talking about a state. They're talking about an actual state, hopefully. I mean, if they're talking about a conspiracy, then that's anti-Semitism. But if they're talking about a state and what that state is doing in a specific land that it controls, that's one conversation. And then you have Jews who are not talking about, I mean, they may say they are, but they're not. They're talking about their identity, right? So you come along with Israeli Apartheid Week because you see an apartheid system in Israel-Palestine, and then a Jew comes along and says, oh, you're attacking my Judaism. They're missing each other. So what progressives need to do is to recognize that fact. We need to recognize that disconnect. And that doesn't mean, right, we have to recognize, first of all, if we're rejecting a global Jewish conspiracy, then Jews who are not Israeli are not responsible for Israel. Even Israeli civilians may not be responsible. Do we hold Americans responsible for Trump when we see them in Europe during the Trump years? I don't know. I don't think so. So we have to remember this distinction between global Jewry and a state. We progressives, I think, are far better at that than the right, right? And American kind of sucks at that. Peter Beinart has talked about this a lot. Like during World War II, we really sucked at understanding the difference between Japan, the state with whom we were at war, and Japanese Americans, right? After 9/11, we really sucked at understanding the difference between Al-Qaeda and Muslims in America. We have a history of sucking at this. So we have to remember to fight that tendency, right? And to identify it. So if someone comes to me, if I am, which I'm personally not, but if I were a Jew whose Judaism was based on Zionism, and someone's protesting the state, I need to remember they're not protesting me, they're protesting the state. And if I am someone who is protesting the state, and I see someone who is Jewish, either visibly Jewish with a kippah, or just even wearing, I would say, some sort of identification with Israel, I need to remember they might not be talking about the actual Israel. They're not probably talking about, they probably don't even know much of what's going on over there. It's probably more of an identity, a way of saying I'm a proud Jew and I don't keep kosher or Sabbath or, maybe, I'm intermarried. Like it's not, my Judaism is this affiliation. And if both sides can remember that, I think we'll get a lot farther, which is why, by the way, I really detest, and I know that everyone on this stage, myself included, has used the phrase, I detest the phrase legitimate criticism of Israel, not only because it evokes, for those of you who are old enough to remember, the legitimate rape comment from a decade ago. I hate it because legitimate criticism suggests that there is illegitimate criticism, and there's no such thing as illegitimate criticism. There is only anti-Semitism, which is to say, if I'm criticizing Israel for doing heading a global conspiracy responsible for the history of racism in America, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or climate change, I don't even consider that criticism of Israel. That's just another category. That's anti-Semitism. So legitimate criticism of Israel is a phrase that's usually used to say you can criticize Israel as long as you don't question the systemic nature of the state, which is a constructed ethnocracy. And that is problematic because I want to criticize that ethnocracy. What we have to distinguish is criticizing the state and calling for harm to individual Jews, right? So if you read Nexus or JDA, they will both clarify that it is anti-Semitic to call for a reversal of fortunes in Israel-Palestine, right? It is anti-Semitic to say, I want to see Jews treated the way Palestinians are treated now. I want to see them killed. I want to see them expelled. I want to see them lose their citizenship in the state in which they live. That would be anti-Semitic, according to every definition. To call for the end of a systemic apartheid system is not to call for inequality. It's to call for equality. So I think that whole phraseology we have to avoid. The whole, anti-Zionism, so-called anti-Zionism is sometimes simply anti-Semitism, and it's incumbent upon us to see that, right? To understand the distinction between it. I think, frankly, we should just retire the term anti-Zionism altogether because of that ambiguity between identity and the state. I think we should talk about Israel as a state and Zionism as someone's personal identity that may or may not be connected to that state at all.
Thank you so much. Did you want to?
Well, yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry for my soapbox.
No,
please.
it was a great soapbox. I feel honored to be next to you while you're on it. I'm curious then, just to hear you talk a little bit more about what happens, and this happens often, when the government of Israel represents itself, right? The state represents itself as the state of the Jewish people, whether they are Israeli or not, right? That ambiguity, people aren't getting that from nowhere. They're hearing it actually over and over from Israel and from American Jewish institutions.
Well, you know what I'm going to say. When Israel claims, or for that matter, when American groups like the ADL claim that Israel that Israel represents all the Jews, and that all Jews are Zionists, all legitimate Jews, all Jews who aren't un-Jews, as Sharansky said, right, are Zionists, they are advocating a key tenet of anti-Semitism, which they admit because all definitions, including IRA, state if you associate all Jews, quad Jews, just for being Jews with Israel, that is anti-Semitic. So it doesn't matter if you're doing it from a so-called pro-Israel position or not. It is a core tenet of anti-Semitism that all Jews are connected and therefore all Jews are responsible for what Israel does. So yeah, I utterly reject that. In fact, I would say, I didn't even get to my fourth point here that I wrote in my notes, that we talk about anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, which again, I don't think is a good phrase because I think we should say this is anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Zionism, but it's not actually. But there's also Zionist anti-Semitism, right? There are Zionists. I mean, by Zionists, I mean people who say they want to get Israel to be more powerful as a Jewish ethnocracy. You think about Kufi, right? The Christians United for Israel, led by John Hagee, who appeared at the dedication of the Jerusalem embassy, who is, and I didn't write the title, which is inflammatory, but I wrote the article that calls him a Islamophobic anti-Semite. He is. I mean, that's just a fact. He talks about Rothschild controlling the global economy to sink the US dollar. He calls Hitler a half-Jew homosexual sent by God to persecute the Jews as punishment. He's literally trying to get Jews killed. I don't just mean in the eschaton, right? We all know that Christian Zionists want to see the eschaton. They want to see the end of days at which Jesus will come back, half the Jews will die, the other half will accept Christ. I'm not talking about the eschaton. He is literally going to Congress, lobbying for war with Iran to bring Armageddon, which will literally, I don't know if Jesus is going to come back or not, I guess I'll find out, but in the here and now, it's definitely going to kill millions of Jews if there's war with Iran, right? So he is a real anti-Semitic danger to Jews in America, which is my primary concern as an American Jew, and Jews in Israel. And yet this is a Zionist, right? Or for that matter, Netanyahu and the entire Israeli rights, closeness with the far with Le Pen in France, and with, of course, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and with the FPO. I mean, my God, I lived in Vienna in 1999 as a Hasidic Jew when the FPO, the neo-Nazi party of Austria, came into the government for the first time. Israel cut off relations with Austria for 3 years over that. And now the FPO is like Israel's best buddy. So I think if we can't call it Zionist anti-Semitism, then what are we doing here? We have to be able to call that out for sure. 100% agree.
Thanks so much. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to give it to Emma, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. And so I'm going to bring it back to definitions, and I think that's something that we've touched on, but I also really want to dig in a little bit more on it, is how might overly broad definitions, such as IRA in this case, potentially threaten free speech, not just on campus, but throughout the entire country and through everywhere, and specifically when it comes to critiquing Israeli policies. You mentioned it, but I was hoping you can dig in a little bit deeper. And then I also want you to do the converse as well. It's like, how can narrow definitions, sometimes fail to capture the whole idea of what anti-Semitism could be?
Yes. Fair warning, I don't think it's like there's a symmetrical converse, so it won't be so neat. But, for folks who have been following the news about the wave of campus protests this spring and the way that they were viciously repressed, right? We're seeing universities call the police on their own peacefully protesting students. Columbia was the first, with, again, nudging from Virginia Fox and Lee Stefanik in Congress. And it's worth noting as well that students from less prestigious universities than Columbia have received harsher penalties, like in the actual legal system for their protests. We've seen professors denied jobs for their statements about Palestine. One I want to mention here is Dr. Raz Siegel, who is an Israeli Jewish expert on the Holocaust, who had a job offer, duly, processed job offer to run the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, revoked just last month after a pressure campaign from the local JCRC, the local Jewish establishment organization there. And Dr. Siegel was called an anti-Semite, called a threat to the Jewish people, because he had applied his scholarly expertise in genocide to discussing Israel's ongoing actions in Gaza. And this is obviously outrageous in itself. And it sets an incredibly dangerous precedent of universities giving in to external political pressure rather than defending their rights to make decisions based on scholarly merit, right? If this is like, sounds kind of wonky to talk about faculty self-governance when people are dying, but it is actually really true that the value of academic freedom, the value of faculty self-governance, right, of universities being independent and making decisions based on their own standards is a really important part of a democratic society. It's not something to take lightly. And to throw it away out of controversy because people are afraid of the politics of Israel-Palestine is really dangerous. It sets a really bad precedent for the future. And it's like worth noting that there's obviously decades of hollowing out of American higher ed for many other reasons, and we have lots of work to do to rebuild higher ed, but this is a really, really harmful development. And we've seen student speech be repressed in much less kind of visible, spectacular ways, but ways that nonetheless like make it hard to learn, hard to study, hard for students to talk to one another. Barnard College, which is affiliated with Columbia, because some Jewish students were made uncomfortable by signs about Palestine on dorm room doors, they banned dorm door signage altogether. So because some Jewish students were uncomfortable, felt threatened by seeing messaging about Palestine, suddenly no one can put anything on their dorm door. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about making Jewish students the face of repressive policies. And I want to really underline also, and like, you know, that the Barnard thing is one example, but we're seeing universities call in external law firms to do reviews of students. We're seeing big law threaten not to hire students who have been involved in protests. Like this is really, it's getting into, you know, affecting people's livelihoods and people's lives beyond campus. And I want to really underline that the argument that protests for Palestinian freedom are anti-Semitic in their goals does really deep damage to the fight against anti-Semitism, right? We get stuck over and over in this conversation, the protests are anti-Semitic, no they're not, and then any evidence of actual anti-Semitic rhetoric or tropes that show up in those protests gets held up as, I told you, they are anti-Semitic. And in reality, what we saw on campuses was we saw students working really hard to establish community norms against all forms of oppression, including anti-Semitism, to educate one another about anti-Semitism. And these loud, angry voices calling all of them anti-Semites really don't help. Like it's actually really harmful to the people who are in the movement trying to do the work of addressing what Josh very aptly called a problem, right? Rather than a central organizing force. And there's all of this conversation about some, you know, disparate, scattered incidents, as opposed to waves of right-wing student organizing, right? Just a few months ago, Ben Lorber flagged for me Candace Owens, the right-wing influencer, speaking at the National Conference of Talking Points USA, which is a right-wing student group. And she got up there in front of the whole convention, and they all chanted, "Christ is King," over and over. That is an actual threat to Jewish safety in America. And there is very little kind of coordinated thought about how to address the rise of organizing that is actually anti-Semitic in its foundations, which is a problem. And so again, it's like the cause of calling for Palestinian freedom is not, it's the furthest thing from anti-Semitic. And when people tar the whole movement as anti-Semitic in its underlying goals and cause, they're making it much harder to actually address anti-Semitism when it shows up, which, by the way, it does in different movements with some regularity, right? Like it showed up at Occupy. It's not, you know, it's in our society, it shows up, it's something that can be addressed, but not if there's this amount of intensity around it. And so there's, again, it's like there's not really a super easy flip side of like what's Are definitions too narrow? Are they not capturing something? You know, there are anti-Semitic incidents on campuses. College-age students today have come of age in an American society that is much more tolerant of overt anti-Semitism than the society, you know, the America of the 1990s and 2000s. And, you know, there are also ways in which, like the existing kind of categories that higher ed institutions have for tracking student identities don't necessarily capture Jews, right? Like colleges will often count the number of Jewish students they have by the answers to questions about religion. And so we know that there are plenty of Jews who will say, you know, what's your religion? They'll say, I'm not religious, I don't have one, but they are actually culturally Jewish. They are ethnically Jewish. They identify with being Jewish. They're not being captured, and so institutions aren't necessarily like sort of seeing the Jewish presence that they have. And also, as Jenna pointed us to, American Jewish institutions teach young Jews to identify strongly with the state of Israel, and to then take it very personally when Israel is criticized. It's like not at all surprising that people are feeling uncomfortable, feeling unsafe. And there is a lot of work to do in helping students work through those feelings of discomfort and distinguish between when are they actually being threatened and when are they being faced with some ideas that are like very deeply upsetting and hard. And this is a place where universities can rely much more heavily, I think, than they have been on their faculty with real expertise, like Josh here, who are both knowledgeable about the actual issues at hand and also trained to help people step back, take a little bit of distance, look at things from different angles, that I think faculty have a lot to offer that hasn't necessarily been brought in. And so that's something they should do. Something they should not do is capitulate to donors or elected officials or outside organizations who are trying to throw their weight around, who really don't have the best interests of the student body or the institution at heart.
Before we go to questions, I just want to thank all three of you. Really, this has been, even for me, this has been really useful, really, and I've learned a lot from all three of you, even though I know all of you pretty well. So again, I just want to give them a hand and thank you guys so much for doing this. It was really fantastic. And now I want to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and someone will come around with a microphone.
Hi, I want to thank all of you. This is my first year at Netroots. This is the best session I've been at so far, and yesterday was just the best day of every conference I've ever been to. In 2019, I just have a little bit of background, just real quick, so you understand where I'm coming from. The last conference I went to before COVID was the ADL conference at the Javits Center in 2019. And I've been a lifelong supporter of ADL until then. I was appalled. I mean, some of it was good, some of it not so good. Some of the speakers. I went to the J Street conference in December 2022. I heard Eric Alterman give a presentation about his new book, and he said, this shouldn't leave the room, that was back then, that the ADL was inflating there is a rise in anti-Semitism, but not as much as the ADL once is leading us to believe. Really bothersome, troublesome. And I went to Penn. I grew up watching Jeopardy. I loved it. Anyway, inside joke, but I forget what I was. Okay, my question. All right, I could talk about a lot of what you all talked about. I identified with everything. Oh, I'm thrilled to see you talked about we need each other more than ever. I got an email from Congregation Beth Elohim in Brooklyn that there's a program next week because there was a pilgrimage to Israel between Trua and J Street. So I'm really glad to see that coming together, because in the midst of all this, there's this Reject AIPAC campaign. which I wholeheartedly support, but it also pains me that we have to resort to that.
I'll be here afterwards for to schmooze, but if you have
What?
a question, I'll be afterwards to schmooze as much as you want, but if you have a question,
Okay,
see
yeah,
how the hand's going up.
my question is, because I've gotten into debate about this, is definitions. You know, in New Jersey, they're trying to push this legislation to adopt the IHRA definition, and we got into this discussion, and I said, well, no, the JDA definition is much better, and I said, well, we don't want to legislate that either. And I said, well, we're not trying to legislate that. And I just want to make sure that's my question.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure that's clear, that we're not trying to legislate any definition.
Yes.
Thank you. No, really? Because that's what I thought, but this discussion I had with other other Jewish progressives, where it was like, where are you getting that from?
Yeah. I can do.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Just very briefly.
Thank you.
It's a tricky thing to explain, but I've explained it over and over, so I'll do it again now, which is that the JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration, is a document written by about a dozen scholars. It's since been signed by like 300, maybe 400 by now, other scholars. And it was written as a direct response to the IHRA definition, but as an educational tool, not a substitute. So it's like this sort of strange thing where it's like, it's in relationship to the IHRA because it's responding to it, but the authors never intended for it to be incorporated into policy for the reasons that I sort of laid out at the beginning about definitions really not being good policy.
And I'll,
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. And if I can just say one other thing, I would encourage everyone, IHRA antisemitism, JDA antisemitism, Nexus antisemitism. Just Google them and read them for yourself. They're like one page each. And by the way, you'll find IHRA antisemitism critique and defense. Like, read these op-eds that have been written in defense or criticizing each one. Familiarize yourself with them. I feel pretty confident you're going to end up where we are, but maybe not. You should be able to choose for yourself. That's what I tell all my students. You should read them. There's nothing scary about it. You should familiarize yourself with them.
and I'll say too, that is one, I was leading that trip, so I'm happy to talk more about that trip. And we just took another group of 30 rabbis this week. We had a pretty intense experience with the IDF. Happy to talk more about that and what it means to have those immersive experiences and engage with education afterwards. And I think to this, like, one of the ways that we're thinking about combating anti-Semitism in a really, really real way is the role of education and the role of saying, like, how can deep understanding of what these definitions mean, actually in a way that we've like learned Jewish texts for thousands of years, help us understand and actually combat anti-Semitism. And naming, like for us, we have 4 very key principles for what is anti-Semitism. One being like using anti-Semitic tropes to describe Israel, using Zionists to describe all Jews, denying Jewish history, denying humanity of Israelis. And by naming, like, these are real, and there will be differences across this table of what that is, and thinking about and naming those distinctions and thinking about how we can learn together beyond a legislative place is crucially important.
The only thing I would add to everything that everyone has said is that when it comes to the codification of a specific definition, there's only one that's being pushed distinctly, and that's the IHRA definition. Everyone, the other two, and I think all of us up here, and I would say the vast majority of American Jews at this point, believe in the necessity for a multiple view on what anti-Semitism is. I mean, we talk about JDA, IRA, Nexus, because that's the big ones, but there's a Biden anti-Semitism of definition. If you go to the U.S. strategy to counter anti-Semitism, the administration created their own.
Which, by the way, I like.
Yeah, it's a very good one, actually.
I like the Biden White House
it's a very good one.
definition. I think it's very good.
Yeah,
I was very pleased with it. Anyway.
And I think one of the things that they did that was really smart was they have, in addition to kind of creating their own, they specifically lifted up the fact that these other definitions, all of them, are tools to be used to identify anti-Semitism. And I think the analogy that you all made, and especially you, Jenna, about how we need to study these the way we study Jewish texts and how we actually, that they can build on each other and work with each other, but at the same time be distinctly different and be a source of conversation is what makes the conversation so important right now, that we should be able to have that out front and in the open.
I think there's more questions.
There's a couple more questions.
Yeah, a couple more questions.
One in the back.
Hey, thanks so much. But yeah, I really appreciate what you presented there. I guess I have a question on where you think that the conversation on anti-Semitism can shift and whether or not mainline Jewish organizations is actually a target for shifting there. For example, are we actually able to push areas like JCRC or JCCs, whether national or local, on these issues, or are some of those ideas so entrenched that they're largely immovable and we need to create new institutions to deal with it?
I'm happy to hear you.
I mean, I will say yes and to every single thing that you said. I think they're so deep, and why all the more. So, like, I'll say our theory of change and role within the ecosystem is to engage in the conversation with mainstream Jewish communities, to say to, like, that is why rabbis, is how we think about it, is turning to them and saying, like, how can we think differently, and how is anti-Semitism actually preventing you from creating meaningful Jewish experiences? And that is the crux of the question here. And beyond that, like, Jewish culture is a critical element in combating white supremacy. And so by creating rich Jewish traditions, we are combating white supremacy. And with that narrative, and by thinking about, like, where is fear, and where is criticism of Israel, and where is real anti-Semitism, and how are they all playing out with each other, is actually the first step in shaping that. But thinking about the ecosystem and not cutting each other out is a critical first step in that.
Yeah, I would say as well that there's a really, really key role for people who are already embedded in those institutions to play in this moment, who are also not on board, right, with the kind of McCarthyist moral panic fear around criticism of Israel and Zionism. That, like, if folks are, it's something that, right, people who are not already in those institutions, don't already have that network of relationships, are going to have a really hard time building. It has to come out of trust and out of relationship. And so for people who are already in spaces like that, if you're feeling a desire for those institutions to be more open, to be less kind of grounded in fear, you're not alone. And I hope, I would be happy also to, like, talk more about what it looks like to try to do that community transformation work from inside. But alternative institution building is also a really worthwhile strategy at this time. Yeah.
And I just want to name, because I should have said this 25 minutes ago, is, like, anti-Semitism deeply hurts Jews, but the people who take the brunt of it within the Jewish community is Jews of color. And we are a multi-racial, multi-ethnic community and religion, and the ways in which anti-Semitism and this conversation around anti-Semitism is playing out prevents that from happening, and that is an existential threat to Jewish institutions, and everyone should be terrified of that.
And the only other thing I would add is that one of the reasons why so many of these Jewish institutions have kind of taken this cause up and it's so embedded is not just because of the fact that it's embedded, but it's also donor pushed, that there are many donors in the federation system, with the ADL, with AJC, with all these other organizations that have a distinct view to push this issue forward, and that they are consistently pushing the executives in those organizations to do more and to say more and to really come down on a much harsher on individuals that have a different view on anti-Semitism. So I think that, one of the ways is actually engaging, and I know with Nexus, so many of the people that have joined Nexus are former heads and former major donors of those organizations that have basically been, in some ways, thrown out, or they feel ostracized because they have a different view on what these organizations should be focusing on. Is this the biggest issue for the Jewish community, or are there other things that we need to be worried about and combating, or is there threats to democracy, or this or that? And these organizations sometimes just say, we don't want to talk about that, and they move on. Really quick on the ADL question that you mentioned before, I do want to note that, there was a time that the ADL was the gold standard when identifying statistics around anti-Semitism. And then after October 7th, one of the things that you never do when you do data collection is change the questions or change how that data is being brought together, because it then corrupts the data and makes it non-comparable. And so when you're looking at the ADL data right now, one of the things that they explicitly did was they changed the threshold for what is anti-Semitism to be any protest against Israel, which made, granted there was a vast increase in anti-Semitism, which you can look at the FBI files statistics to show that, or even the AJC statistics, but with the ADL ones, it was an exponential, massive growth simply by the virtue of the fact that any protest related to Israel was considered anti-Semitic. And so it's being really important to understand what this data is and how it's being used.
If I can just respond, I'm sorry, may I?
Oh.
Just one quick, to your question on Jewish communal establishment. I just plug a colleague of mine, Lila Corden-Berman, who wrote a book a few years ago, The Jewish Philanthropic Complex, which addresses how changing U.S. tax codes and the growing wealth gap has led a few oligarchs within the Jewish community. They don't have global nefarious power, but they have outsized power in the Jewish community. And even if the base of Jews, especially young Jews, is growing more and more disconnected from Israel as the core of their identity, but they have outsized power. So if you don't know that book, you're nodding your head, you obviously know it, but if others don't know that book, it's a very good read, very important, and speaks directly to this point. Sorry.
Yes, no, and I think, that relates also to the way that I try to think and talk about the campus question, which is that all of this is happening in a context of widening inequality, of the accumulation of wealth among the very few, right? That's why there are mega donors who have the ability to pressure universities into doing stuff that's against their interests. I just couldn't let, I can't let the comment about the ADL having ever been a gold standard stand. I object.
Go ahead.
Awesome. By the way,
totally
so does this book here also objects to that.
No,
to that.
absolutely.
I will say, though, I have personal friends who work for ADL, and Jewish
Yes.
Currents has written about this. There are wonderful people doing
Really
great work
Yes.
at ADL
Yes.
who are being threatened with being fired if they ever speak out against the leadership.
Yes.
So I just want to say, I don't feel comfortable giving them money anymore because of the leadership, but I know from personal knowledge that there are good people doing good work being suppressed.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll take, I don't know how much time we have.
Whatever. I'm here
more-
to
I'm
one.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please,
There's
in the
two more
front. Yeah.
questions. Yeah, up
Yeah,
front.
for one and then two. Or it doesn't matter which order, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't
We'll
matter.
take both of them. I think he's the microphone. He's going to wait just a second. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, I deeply appreciate all that I've heard today. And it's easy to see how the term anti-Semitism is exploited by folks on the right and by defenders of Israel. And it's clear to see that. I'm wondering, in that context and the ways in which we're under siege in this moment, and we have to sort of fight back against that, do we have the luxury to actually identify anti-Semitism in our own ranks, like on the left? And because it's not something that we really talk about very often. We talk about how the term is being exploited, but I don't see very often where we actually identified among our own ranks, because we don't feel like we actually, again, have the luxury to do so. So I guess my question is do you think that it's worthwhile doing that, and whether we have the luxury to do that?
Yeah. I would say that it's not a luxury, it's a necessity.
I wrote the same thing.
I
I wrote vital necessity.
Okay, all right, we'll add the vital.
Yes.
But,
I just don't see it happening very often.
No, well, and so I'll say a few things, right? One is that in a moment where any sort of incident that could be construed as anti-Semitism sort of in the vicinity of a left-wing political activity gets blown up, right? There's a huge media apparatus that is making stories out of things that, like, it turns out the comment about go back to Poland at Columbia was a random counter-protester outside the gates of the university, right? There is a media apparatus that blows up anything that can be construed as anti-Semitic, and so people are understandably wary of confronting things publicly. And I would say that a lot of the time, these things get confronted in private, right? It's like a call in more than call out situation. I do think that organizations, coalitions have a responsibility to sort of think intentionally about where they want to approach things in that more kind of like, hey, that's not okay, we're not doing that in the future kind of way, and where they want to do some public distancing and condemnation. But, you know, the reason behind confronting it, whether it's public or private, is that there's a really good reason why one of the sort of nicknames of anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, right? That when anti-Semitism pops up on the left, it pops up to distract us from the actual actors and systems that are oppressing us, and it aims ire and resentment at Jews instead of at the actual institutions and systems that are keeping people down. And so if we don't confront anti-Semitism in our ranks, if you don't confront people talking about, you know, Jewish landlords in a housing movement, for example, you're letting them be confused about what the actual material conditions that they're organizing in and against are. And so it's not like a nice to have, it's a have to have, because you have to be able to see the world around you clearly, and you have to be able to build coalitions that are broad enough to confront what you're up against.
I agree with every word she just said. I would only, both that, you know, if we don't confront it, then you give fodder to those who are trying to stop us. That it's above all, it's a distortion, right? We don't fight the actual conditions that are oppressing people. It's a distraction. That's why the right loves it so much, and the importance of alliances. I will only add to that what we say in Hebrew is lishma, which is to say, also we should fight anti-Semitism because it's wrong. Like, we can't tolerate that kind of conspiracy hate-mongering among us. I mean, it undermines everything we're about, and it endangers Jews. So, I mean, that's also its own thing. It's not only a function of fighting the rights, suppression of pro-Palestinian protests or whatever. It's also it's that, and its alliances, and it's seeing clearly, and it's for its own sake. I mean, if we say we're going to make an exception for this form of hatred among us, I mean, what are we, and how are we supposed to have any credence to fight anything if that's the way we're going to live?
And I think I'll just add to what Emma was saying is Trua had an incident or a powerful situation a number of years ago where we were in a coalition supporting laundry workers, and the union, the bosses were a group of Hasidic Orthodox Jews, and they came to us and said, can you help us understand what we need to say to win this and not be anti-Semitic? And they won. And I think if it hadn't been, like if anti-Semitism had fueled that campaign, intentional or unintentional, likely unintentional, the chances of them winning is actually smaller. And I think fighting anti-Semitism and naming and being aware of what is anti-Semitic helps us win, beyond the fact that it is so critically important to be stopping it. It's a strategic priority as well.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for doing the panel. I'm just going to put a reflection out there as a Jewish person. I live in New Orleans, and sort of what this has been like for me. And it's not exactly on your topic, but it is, which is I'm basically ashamed of my community all the way around. I think they've said terrible, awful things when I've been there about Palestinians and Arabs. I've literally had I've been confronted by people for my own Facebook posts, which are not horribly radical. Sort of in public, I really don't even feel welcome there anymore in my own community. I've basically kind of quit being a Jew anyway, because I guess I'm kind of we live in science fiction right now, and it doesn't make any sense to me, but that sort of forced me into making that decision that the community, which I was a real part of before this, and went regularly to services, and my sister's a rabbi, I do not feel like hanging out with him. And also, I'm pretty much ashamed of most Israelis. And I don't find there to be a real legitimate excuse for this, because I spent my whole life growing up in a household that was super concerned about anti-Semitism, and all we learned about was the Holocaust. My parents were like, it's literally like was dysfunctional how much my parents were obsessed with it. And it's taken me a good deal of my life to get unobsessed. But this is insane to think that this was okay to allow like some trauma to be an excuse to carry out this kind of action on another group of humans. And there's just like zero accountability for any of that. And I wonder if you guys could just react to that, because I, as a Jewish person, I don't even think I'm welcome in my community anymore. Like, I basically show up there and people yell at me. And I'm sort of like, you know, one lady, I ended up telling her, look, I'm a fucking American first, okay? And I'm human first, okay? And being human and being American means that I kind of believe in like a pluralistic society. At least the last 60 years we've had that. And I'm not gonna sit around here and listen to like crazy shit from you. But I think my point is, I don't think I'm the only person that feels like this. I think it's done real damage to a lot of people who really love some of the cultural aspects of Judaism, but just find it kind of like impossible to even how you reconcile it. And I'll shut up now, but I think you get my point.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say one quick thing, and then I want to let them all. I will say this. I hear it, and all right. I guess this is our last question. But we'll be around. You guys can talk to us afterwards as well. After October 7th, I will say I wasn't with Nexus, wasn't created, it wasn't really formalized at that point. I was working at J Street at that moment. And I will say that I was shocked at how quickly and how insistent the vast majority of the Jewish community, I jokingly say, we lost our mind after the 7th. And many have not come back to their senses. And I find it to be really, as someone who's raising their kids Jewish, would go to temple, and I find it very difficult, just like you, to engage in, you know, the organized space now of the Jewish life, simply by virtue of the fact that it's the way people talk, the way people do things, is really, in many ways, disgusting. And I was speaking recently to someone who had interviewed one of the heads of a major Jewish organization, and I said, this person used to be a normal, sane human being who could understand the differences on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that this wasn't, that you could have nuanced views. And I think, you know, we see the same thing happening on anti-Semitism, the way we used to see it in Israel-Palestine back in 2010, that you can have, that there is no nuanced view right now in the Jewish community on it. And they said that after the 7th, they just, all pretense went out the window, and it all became about fear and stoking that fear, which I know has been a constant refrain from, I think, the three panelists as well on this issue. Jenna, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I'm going to take my rabbi liberty, and I'm sorry in advance that this is what I would say to you if you had come into my office and we were having this conversation. And I want to just start and say, like, I'm sorry. Like, that, like, deep pain is so real, and is just, like, the deepest form of hurt, of, like, this buy-in of, like, this is a tradition and this is something that, like, is mine, and you, like, you own it and you deserve to own it. Every single Jew was standing at Sinai. Like, this is your tradition and you own it, and nobody gets to take it away from you. And I'm thinking about Rabbi B'nai Lappi, who has, like, transformed the way that I have like made sense of Judaism and this moment. And she teaches that the entirety of the world is shaped through master stories, and every master story inevitably crashes. And the way in which we respond to that master story to that crash is the thing that makes us. And she would say is the thing that actually also saves Judaism. And there's three options. One is to build a wall around the master story and keep any criticism of that master story out. The other is to completely reject the master story. And the third is to fuse the two and to say, okay, this master story isn't working, but we need to think about another way. And she says, like, that is what saved Judaism when the temple collapsed. Because this group of fringy, radical people said, actually, the temple was never working for me. Are you kidding me? But they said, we need another way. And they built the Talmud, they built Rabbinic Judaism, and they're the people that saved Judaism. And so we can't step away. We need to come up with an option 3, and that's what we get to do together. So please don't step away. Judaism needs you too much.
Just very quick, first of all, I just want to share my empathy and agreement with everything that was said. Try being Orthodox on the left, and you'll get a taste of what it means to be not part of a community. I was asked to leave my community of many years because of my views. So I sympathize and empathize, and I'm so sorry. I'll just tell you a couple. First of all, I want to say whatever you choose, I validate you, and I don't blame you for any choice you make. But I will say 2 things. For me, one solution is fuck them. This is my Judaism, and they're not going to take it away from me. And there was a discussion I had once. There's a group that if you're on Facebook, I know that's my age. I'm not on Instagram, on Facebook. But there's a group that I founded with a woman named Mira Sukharov called Drachim, D-R-A-C-H-I-M, which is filled with people who, after October 7th, felt that the Jewish community had lost its mind, but they felt alienated from the left that was basically celebrating October 7th. And we wanted something that would oppose October 7th and oppose the war in Gaza. So we have this group. Someone said, I'm having a new Passover ceremony. I'm not going to do Passover because it's been ruined by mainstream Judaism. I'm doing this other thing. And I said, do what you want, but I'm having a Passover Seder with kosher matzah. And I'm not going to let them take that from me. Screw them. So yeah, that would just be my only response. And there is, if you go online, there's people like you, and I guess me, whatever, all over the place. Unfortunately, they don't live in the same place. There are a few places like that on the what do you call it? On the west side, the west side of Washington Heights. There's a place where, as one person put it to me, if you think Biden should still run for, it's Orthodox. If you think Biden should still run for president, you're like on the extreme right. I'm like, oh, Orthodox space like that is not very common. So these, there are places like that where people are more amenable to human rights as a guiding principle, but they're thin in places like New Orleans or even where I live in Chicago. But they exist online, and I would just encourage you to explore them before you make a final decision. For what it's worth, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say, you're not alone, and I bet, I'm happy to think with you. I feel like between this panel and people in the room and even people at the conference, we could probably do a little Jewish geography and find you some people in New Orleans
we got a
to hang
minion in
out
this
with.
room right now.
No, but in New Orleans, I'm that's my organizer.
Yeah.
No, it's not about friends, it's about Jewish community.
I know, but you see, I'm kind of being honest, I appreciate that you guys are reaching out. I do know how to find Jewish people in New Orleans who will agree with me that we live in science fiction and that this is insane, okay? So I have some friends like that. I'm just pointing out an organized Jewish space.
Yeah.
There is no tolerance for people with another point of view right now without you having to go there to get in a fight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't mind fighting people because I'm like one of those Jews that'll fight with anybody anytime. But I don't want to on Friday night.
Yeah, 100%. You're identifying something very real.
Yeah.
And I love people even if I don't agree with them with all my heart. I'm not trying to hurt them, but I don't want them to come up to me in the middle of Jazz Fest and be like, you're insane, your kid is going to be killed by a Palestinian. And I'm like, you live in New Orleans. This matters so random. For that to happen, for someone to make it over here from Gaza to murder my kid in my house and select me and so on. But really, and this is like a Jewish leader that told me. My point is, they're so rational. It's really, I don't want to engage in that.
Yeah.
I agree.
I don't want to hurt people's feelings, and I don't want to make fun of them or whatever, but I am ashamed of what they're doing because they're representing my community.
I feel you so strongly. I can't put into words how much I feel you.
Yeah, I think we're all going through this, by the way. I can give you a hug. Come on. Okay? There's not a lot we can do about it. The world is very difficult. That's what we were born with as Jews.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay?
With that, because I have a note saying we're supposed to be done, I really appreciate all of you that came and the fact that you stayed 30 minutes extra for this Q&A, which I think was really inspireful and really helpful. So again, thank you to all 3 of you for coming and doing this and for coming to Netroots, and look forward to seeing everyone at the conference later today. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.